Okay, men, so we are in part 3 of an 8-part series on what it means to lead well. These are 8 leadership lessons that every man needs, and we're looking at different stories from Scripture to teach us, to instruct us, to guide us about how we can be better leaders with ourselves, with our families, in our places of business, in our social circles. But I really do believe that our world and the world at large rises and falls with the quality of leadership that exists. And as people of faith, I think that we as men are called to be kind of the epitome of what it means to be a leader and to lead well. And so we've been talking about these different leadership lessons, and today we'll jump into lesson number 3. In front of you is a piece of paper. On one side, it's got some fill in the blanks. That's for you to use as a tool if helpful. If not helpful, that's fine. Don't use it. And then on the back side later, we'll have some time for discussion at your tables. And the discussion questions are also on the back side of this piece of paper. And so coming out of Halloween, I spent a little bit of time kind of revisiting some of my favorite Halloween movies. This is something that I do solo in my life. One, because my wife gets really scared when we watch movies, and so she doesn't watch with me, but also because I'm probably the most annoying person to watch scary movies with. I'm obnoxious in the sense that it's probably not limited to scary movies, but for the sake of this example, scary movies, because I have a running commentary the whole movie. Scary movies, they have this kind of typical cliche where the main characters do stupid things that lead them to the places where they get confronted by the monster or the bad guy or the serial killer or whatever it may be, right? And so I'm constantly like, no, why would you separate? Like if you're in a group and you're in a dangerous situation, you always remain together. Don't split up and you go this way and the other person go that way. So I'm constantly commentating on all of the poor decisions that people are making in these scary movies that lead them to the place where inevitably they get harmed or killed or life threatened or whatever it may be. But I was thinking about it in the context of what we're going to talk about today and how easy it is on the couch with the lights on in the privacy and safety of my home to talk about all of the decisions that people should be making in really intense, dangerous, high-pressure moments when adrenaline is running high and your emotions or fears are out of control, and how much more difficult those moments are to make wise decisions. And I think the same is true of our lives. There are a lot of environments in our lives that when we look at it as an outside observer or from like a removed perspective, it's really easy to be like, oh, you should do this and you should have done that, and why didn't you? But then when it comes to us, when the stakes are high, when there's a really difficult conversation happening in the boardroom or in the bedroom, and we're trying to navigate it, and we feel all of the emotions that are running through our body or the adrenaline that's coursing through our veins, it's a whole lot harder to lead well. It's a whole lot harder to act responsibly. It's a whole lot harder to be the men that we're called to be. And so what we're going to be talking about today is this idea of how do we respond under pressure and under fire when the stakes are high, when the risks are high, when the emotions are high, when we feel challenged and when we feel threatened by what's happening in the world around us. Oftentimes, the easiest thing to do is just to kind of step back. I don't know if y'all are aware of that kind of Homer Simpson meme or GIF where he just kind of leans back into the bushes. I think that's the tendency that we do as men sometimes when we're placed in a kind of a precarious situation, when what we need to do is step out and be bold or be courageous or hold the line on something or remain committed to our values and our principles. It is a whole lot easier to just kind of lean back and not step up and not be courageous. And so the whole idea that we're going to be talking about this morning is that leadership means being courageous under fire. When it's a whole lot easier to not speak up, when it's a whole lot easier to not show up, when it's a whole lot easier to compromise, when it's a whole lot easier to cave, What leadership means is being courageous in those moments. And the way that we're going to get to this is we're going to look at the story of a man named Daniel. Now, the story of Daniel that we're looking at, oftentimes children's Bibles are wonderful, Bible stories are great, but they kind of neuter the stories that actually exist in Scripture. Because all of the pictures that we've probably seen, if you're familiar with the kids' Bible version of Daniel in the lion's den, is Daniel's this young guy, and he's in the lion's den, and the lions are smiling. And that's not actually the story. The story that we're looking at with Daniel is Daniel's been a prisoner in a foreign-controlled empire most of his adult life. Daniel is 80 years old, give or take a couple of years. So Daniel is well into kind of that senior twilight season of his life. And he has lived through regime changes, and he has been a prisoner of war for decades upon decades. And what Daniel has navigated is how to be a man of faith in a world where no one else around you is a man of faith. He's living out his Jewish faith in a foreign country, with a foreign God, with foreign rulers, but he's remained committed and consistent in who he's called to be, the values that he holds, and the faith that's important to him. And so the story that we're looking at from Daniel is, what are the leadership lessons we can learn from Daniel about how to do this well? Now, the backdrop for this particular context and story that we're looking at with Daniel is King Darius is this Persian king, and he's got all of these rulers, and he's got all of these administrators and officials, and he's got 120 satraps, and he's got 3 administrators, and he's got this whole kind of administrative system that manages his empire. And Daniel is one of the 3 administrators, and so then there's all of these other people, and then Daniel. All these other people, they are from this Babylonian kind of area. And Daniel's the one outsider who's a man of Jewish faith. He believes in God. And what happens is everybody around Daniel despises Daniel because he is upright and he is virtuous and he is a man of conviction and principles and values. And so they start to plot and conspire against Daniel to figure out how to kind of remove him from authority and power. This is what it says in Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 4. It says, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And so what they decide to do is they decide that because he is unimpeachable in character and in his excellence in his profession, they're going to have to find a way to trap him, to get him out of office and try to get him kind of removed from his role. And they do that. They're going to attack the place that he holds most important, and that's his faith. And so what they conspire to do is to catch him praying to his God in the context of a whole bunch of rules that don't allow you to pray to your God. So what they try to do is they try to manipulate the king and say, listen, create some edicts that say that for the next 30 days, the only thing that people can pray to is not any foreign gods, but it's to you, king. And if they do pray to someone other than you, that they get thrown into the lion's den. And the king's like, okay, I guess. He doesn't really understand. He's being manipulated in this moment. And so this is the law that gets passed. And then this is what we see happen with Daniel, because he's now in this difficult situation where he has the opportunity to step back, to kind of slink back, to cave, to allow his convictions to fall to the wayside, because there's now going to be consequence for standing up for what he believes in and for standing up for his faith. In the same way that there is for us as men. The situations that we find ourselves in carry consequences. And sometimes we fear the consequences more than we prioritize the values that we hold and the principles that we stand for and the faith that is important to us. And so in those moments when there's actually a cost to believing what you believe or living out the values that you live out, what choice will we make? So the first lesson that we see from Daniel is that courage isn't found, it's built. This is what we see in Daniel verse 10, chapter 6. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." In this moment of crisis, in this moment of uncertainty and risk, Daniel recognized that he had a foundation to fall back upon. He wasn't cut off and searching for some way forward. What happened was Daniel reverted back to the habits that he had already built. I think this is one of the things that we miss as men, is confidence often comes and courage often comes from that which we have repeated over and over and over again. One of the challenges of being in a brand new situation is you have no experience and exposure to that environment to fall back upon. Getting up here and speaking for me doesn't take any courage because I've done it so many times. If I was in a new place or a new room with a different group of people, there would be some uncertainty because there's no experience in that moment with that situation. For Daniel, what happens to Daniel is he is consistently 3 times a day, probably for decades, gotten on his knees and prayed to God. And so when the stakes get high, Daniel does what he has always done. He reverts back to his habits and his routines and his disciplines. Strong leaders build courage long before they need it in the daily, consistent habits. I love the way that author James Clear, who wrote the book Atomic Habits, says it. He says that we don't rise to the level of our goals, but we fall to the level of our systems. We fall to those repeated habitual patterns and behaviors that we carry out over and over and over again. And this is what we see with Daniel. The second, I think, thing that we learn from Daniel's story is that courage admits its limits. I think sometimes we have a misplaced understanding of what courage looks like. Courage isn't knowing that you're Superman, that you are 40 feet tall and bulletproof. Courage is responding to a situation even though you might feel fear and having the self-awareness to know where your boundaries are and where your limitations are. This is what happens with Daniel. He hears about the decree. He responds and falls back upon his habits, these routines and disciplines that he's built over decades. And this is the moment that this other group of people kind of catch him in the act. But look at what they catch him doing. It says in verse 11, it says, "These men went as a group and found Daniel praying, just as they thought they would, and asking God for help." Daniel's courage in this story is not, the moral of the story isn't, look how great Daniel is. Look how strong and courageous Daniel is. The moral of the story is Daniel knows where his strength comes from. Daniel knows where his courage rests upon and relies upon. And so for Daniel, what we see is Daniel goes to the source of ultimate courage and the source of ultimate strength and power. And that's to God. Because Daniel knows that on his own, he can't do it all. And I think this is the temptation that we as men struggle with, is we think what it means to be strong, what it means to be powerful, what it means to be courageous, is that we take it all on ourselves and we do it all on our own. And what Daniel is showing us is, no, this is not what courage looks like. Courage is recognizing our weaknesses. Courage is recognizing our limitations and then drawing on God's strength to supply what we are deficient in. I mean, Scripture talks about God's strength is made perfect in our weaknesses. This is what Daniel's modeling for us. And then the last lesson about what it means to be a courageous leader that we can take from Daniel's story is that courage is contagious. So in this story of Daniel, after he's caught praying, it initiates a whole bunch of consequences as stipulated by the decree that the king had set. And this decree is that anybody caught praying to anyone other than the king is going to be thrown into the lion's den. So all of these men, they say, aha, gotcha. They take Daniel to the king. He's arrested. He's put in chains. And they march Daniel into the lion's den. The king realizes he's kind of caught in a catch-22 because of what the decree stipulates. He can't do anything for Daniel, who he has fondness and affection for. And so as they roll the stone over the entrance to the lion's den, the king kind of whispers in Daniel's ear, may your God save you and protect you. The king's rooting for Daniel to survive this, but his hands are tied. And what I love about Daniel's courage is it's not like he grabbed a sword and took on the whole army on his own. You know, we see movies like this and we think like, that's courage. No, Daniel's courage was, I think, for at least for me, way more relatable because he was a man of commitment and a man of conviction and a man of consistency. And he stayed true to kind of his North Star, his faith in God, without knowing how the story was going to end. We read the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and for those of us that know the story, we know that he comes out okay. Daniel had no idea how this was going to turn out. Daniel, I'm assuming, assumed that this was not going to go favorably just because of the circumstance that he was in, and yet he didn't waver. There's another story in the book of Daniel about three men in a similar situation. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're asked to bow before the king, and they resist, and they say, guys, if you don't bow before the king, we're going to throw you in this fiery furnace. Maybe some of you have heard this story. And they say, we're not going to bow because we believe our God will save us. And then this is one of my favorite lines in all of Scripture. And then they say, and even if he doesn't, we're not giving in. We don't know the outcome of how this is going to go. Even if God doesn't save us, even if this doesn't turn out favorably for us, we're holding to our convictions. And this is what Daniel does. The stones rolled over the entrance to the lion's den. The next day, the king comes back with his whole court, all of the men who've kind of accused Daniel on trumped up charges. They're there waiting to see Daniel been devoured. And what happens is the king kind of yells into the entrance of the cave. He's like, Daniel, are you okay? And Daniel yells back, may the king live forever. And the king's like, oh my goodness. In this moment, what we see is Daniel's courage being contagious for the king, because not only does it inspire the king that Daniel's been saved by his God, but now the king is able to be courageous about the faith that Daniel has demonstrated. Because this is what happens next. The king issues a decree. He issues a new decree after he's thrown all these other guys in prison. He says, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and revere the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. The king is able to be bold, to be courageous, to issue this decree to his entire kingdom about what he now is convinced of and believes to be true because of the courage that Daniel has demonstrated. This courage inspires other people. Think about situations in our lives when you see somebody stand up for something or you have stood up for something. Once somebody resists, once somebody holds firm to their values, once somebody voices what they know to be wrong or unfair, you start to build a little momentum. It starts to spread. It starts to be contagious. People are like, no, I'll stand arm in arm with you on this idea or for this principle. But it takes somebody going first. It takes somebody saying, no, this is wrong. We're not gonna cave in this. Or no, these are our principles. These are our values as a family. We're not giving in on this. Or no, my marriage is too important. I'm not just gonna acquiesce and ignore the issues that we're facing. Let's talk about this. Let's address this. It means stepping up. But when you do, and when you lead with courage, even though you might feel fear, even though you have no idea how it's going to play out, it begins to inspire others around you. And as men of faith, this is who we're called to be. We're called to be courageous leaders. but not courage of our own making, not courage of our own strength and power, but courage that's borrowed from and relies upon the power and the strength of God at work in our lives. So for the rest of our time together, I want to invite you to turn to your tables and to begin a conversation. On the back side of your paper, there's some questions. These are the same questions that we'll put on the screen here. Before you jump into conversation, just take a minute to just introduce yourselves to the men at your table. Even if you know some of them, let's just pretend nobody knows each other this morning, and just introduce yourself, and then we'll invite you to spend the rest of our time together in conversation this morning.